Hello and welcome, and thank you for all those of you who ask about my mom. My mom has recovered from her surgery, and she's doing very well. We have now reached the year 2000. The year 2000 is very notable for Florida State, as it was the final season of Florida State's 15-year streak of dominance. Florida State spent 15 years in the top 5, a feat that was never surpassed until Alabama surpassed it just recently. Florida State played in 5 national championships and were a field goal away from playing in several more national championships. The Seminoles dominated that 15-year period like no other. But the year 2000 was really the final year of that Florida State dominance. Florida State would come into the season rated number 2 behind Nebraska, who was rated number 1 to start the 2000 season. It's easy to forget that there was a period when Nebraska was a very good team. Florida State would open the season with 5 relatively easy victories over weaker ACC opponents. The most notable of these 5 first victories came over Georgia Tech and North Carolina. Then Florida State would head to the Orange Bowl to play hated rival Miami. This game is very notable because while Florida State and Miami would play games in later years with potentially national championship implications, the reality is this is the last year where both teams had a legitimately good shot to play for the national championship if one of them won. Now, I know that some people will point out that there were a couple years during the Jimbo years where Miami was a top 10 team when they played the Seminoles, but Florida State beat Miami all of those times, and then Miami went on to lose 4 straight games following those losses, eliminating Miami from any hope of national championship contention. This was before Miami was smashed with all kinds of sanctions, and the Hurricanes lost their swag. Florida State, unfortunately, would lose to hated in-state rival Miami, as it seems to happen so often, by missing a field goal. Following another loss to Miami, then Florida State would head to play NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina. NC State was rated 21st at the time, but Florida State made short work of them. The Noles won 58-14. Following a very easy and statement-making victory over North Carolina, Florida State would head home to play hated rival Clemson. Clemson was 10th at the time, but would get absolutely picked apart by the Seminoles, 54-7, as Florida State continued to make a statement. Florida State would get a relatively easy win over Wake Forest the next weekend before having one final chance to make a statement with the hope of heading to the national championship game. And Florida State would welcome Florida into Tallahassee the only way the Noles ever should, by absolutely beating the tar out of the Gator. Florida State would win this game 30-7. So this meant there was unanimous number 1. Oklahoma was the only undefeated team in 2000. There were 5 other one-loss teams vying for the number 1 spot. This included Miami, Florida State, Washington, Ohio State, and Virginia Tech. When the AP poll came out, it seemed pretty set that Miami would play Oklahoma since Miami had beaten Florida State. Miami was ranked number 2, Florida State was ranked number 3. One day later, the coaches poll would come out. The coaches poll would follow the example of the Associated Press poll, with Miami sitting at number 2 and Florida State at number 3. Further proving that the BCS system was flawed, the computers who carried more weight in that era put Florida State at 2. This meant that Florida State would head back to the national championship game. So even though Miami kind of got screwed, the Seminoles would head back to the national championship game in the 2000 season, where the Noles would play Oklahoma in the Orange Bowl. Unfortunately, Florida State offensive coordinator Mark Richt would decide to leave to go become the head coach of Georgia. Now, I know today a lot of times when coordinators get jobs somewhere else, they'll stay and coach that final ball game as a coordinator before taking over the reins of the new job they have. But that isn't the way things were done back then. Mark Richt would leave Florida State before the national championship game. This is notable, as you'll see in a minute, because Florida State's offense really couldn't do anything. On top of that, Mark Richt's departure set in motion a set of dominoes that would lead to a long period of turmoil for the Seminoles.
You think of Oklahoma, you think of Bud Wilkinson in the 50s with all the great teams. Barry Switzer dominating the mid-70s and winning another title in 85. Now they go for their 7th championship tonight under Bob Stoops. For Florida State, well, Bobby Bowden's built a dynasty of his own in 25 years in Tallahassee. They have been in this game 3 straight years. They've won 2 championships, one in the 90s, one to start the year 2000 a year ago in the Sugar Bowl. Now they're ready to try to add another tonight. Going for number 1. Tim Duncan about set to go to the football. 67 FedEx Orange Bowl and a packed house in Miami. We're underway.
A big blow. Mickey Andrews says he is their best defensive back by far, and Mickey always plays a lot of defensive backs, says you're always coaching next year's team. So these guys that are in there, Tatum and Samuels, have played some, but not the quality of Tatum. Cody, excuse me.
First and 10, here's works inside again. Nice run. Out inside the 25 to the 23. It was out there offensively.
So hurry up.
And Works got it. And the lead blocker is Torrance Marshall, or at least one of them.
Oklahoma broke the huddle and went to the line.
One big one on this drive. Still it's first and 15 now. Apple flares it out. He's got a guy draped all over him, Tommy Polley. Second down and 7, back in the red zone. 11th play of the Sooner drive. Heupel, shovel pass, what Bob was just talking about. But this time, Quentin Griffin's going down.
At that time, a three-man line. Mickey said...
Josh Heupel flares it out. Luttrell couldn't hold it. His fullback. 7. This is from 42. Winky, quick throw. And Anquan Bolden went one way. The pass went the other. Incomplete. Oklahoma showing a possible blitz. Winky pump fakes. Now he's going to go deep again. Is it out there? Incomplete. Robert Morgan. And went long again on third down. That's been the story all night. Winky, play fake. Throws. It is almost intercepted. He threw into triple coverage.
Yeah, we just can't fall within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage.
Here they come. Torrance Marshall blitzing. Winky pump fakes. Lofts it out. It's got a man there. And it's broken up at the very last moment by Derek Strait. Anquan Bolden had a step. 4% conversion rate tonight. Winky in trouble. Got away from one. Now scrambling. And the fumble. Oklahoma's got it at the 15-yard line. Another defensive play, and it's Ray Williams. Oklahoma just outside the FSU 10. Quentin Griffin, touchdown! Foot coming up, high snap over the Ferguson's head, and he's now going to run back.
Smart move.
And take a safety. That is a brilliant move by the punter.
Smart move. Can you believe it? You got the game. There's a minute left to go, and the snap goes over. What if he hadn't gotten in the end zone here? This is a great move by the punter.
If he wouldn't have gotten in the end zone, Florida State would have had a first and goal. If he would have let them get to the ball first, it would have been a touchdown.
Exactly.
Following a mediocre offensive performance in the Orange Bowl and a loss of a national championship, the Seminoles, Florida State would start the 2001 season rated number 6. However, there was this distinct feeling among Seminole fans I knew and around the university that Florida State was just not the same team they had been for the previous 15 seasons. Almost everybody was aware that the end of Florida State's dominant era was the 2000 season. We all were bracing ourselves for a period of rebuild. Florida State would open the season by pantsing Duke before destroying UAB. And then the reality of what had changed would set in as Florida State would play unranked North Carolina on September 22nd at noon and be annihilated 41-9. And this was really just more evidence that the time of Florida State was over. The Seminoles would go on to crush Wake Forest the following week before the eventual national champion Miami Hurricanes would come to Tallahassee and outclass Florida State in every way, winning 49-27 in a completely one-sided beating. I remember watching that game. I was young, but I remember watching that game, and that score wasn't even actually that close. Miami had no problem beating Florida State. The Noles would win 3 straight games, with the most notable of which being a 52-31 victory over 10th-ranked Maryland before dropping games to NC State and 4th-ranked Florida. Florida State would end the season by winning the ACC championship by beating Georgia Tech and would head to the Gator Bowl to play Virginia Tech, who at the time was not an ACC team. They were still a Big East team. Florida State would beat Virginia Tech 30-17. The 2001 season was the first season where it seemed like the Bobby Bowden era was coming to an end. I can distinctly remember a lot of people around me at that time and around the university at that time were asking how much longer Bobby Bowden could possibly coach. Bobby Bowden would also promote his own son, Jeff Bowden, to becoming Florida State's offensive coordinator after Mark Richt left. This will become very notable as time goes on because Jeff Bowden, it becomes a massive issue for Bobby Bowden that really hurts him in the long run. The 2002 season started with a little bit more hope than the 2001 season, as Florida State would start the season at number 3. Florida State would play their annual first week cream puff, Iowa State, and it became instantly apparent that this was not going to be a big turnaround in one season, as Florida State only beat Iowa State by a touchdown. Before 3 easy victories over weak ACC opponents, Virginia, Maryland, and Duke, State would play Louisville on September 22nd at 8 o'clock at night. Now, this is an interesting game. Louisville was on the way up. At this time, Louisville would be what you would call now a Group of 5 team. They won an ACC team, but they had recently they would compete with Miami in coming years. But this game was really the one, in my opinion, that put Louisville on the map and gave them that opportunity to leave the Group of 5 and become a Power 5 team. 4th-ranked Florida State would be shockingly upset by Louisville, 26-20 in overtime. Florida State would beat an unranked Clemson the following week before headed to Miami to play the number 1 defending national champion Hurricane. Now, I remember watching this game. This was another heart-wrenching disaster of a loss. Maybe could have changed the fortune of Florida State, as a missed field goal would again cost Florida State a victory over Miami. This Miami team was fantastic that year, as well as they would head all the way back to the national championship game for having one of the largest screw jobs of all time in college football called against them. One of the most embarrassing penalties. Absolute disgusting. And this is coming from a Seminole fan. I hate the Hurricanes, but there was no way Ohio State won the 2001-2002 national championship.
Glenn Sharp, 31 on Chris Gamble, number 7. Oh, that's a tough call there. What about this angle? Bad call. Bad call.
The Noles would lose 27-28 before going to play 6th-ranked Notre Dame and getting beat by 10, which would end any hope, any shred of hope Florida State had of getting back into the national championship picture. The Seminoles would roll off 3 straight wins following those losses over, again, fairly commonly weak ACC opponents, Wake Forest, Georgia Tech, and North Carolina. Florida State would again lose to NC State for the 2nd consecutive year, 17-7, before happily upsetting the Gators 31-14. Something that, if you followed Florida State around this time, you know that Chris Ricks, Florida State starting quarterback around this time, never beat Miami, even though he was a 5th or 6th year senior when he left Florida State. But I think he never lost to Florida, or he might have lost one time. But he often performed very well against Florida. Florida State would go to the Sugar Bowl to play Georgia. Florida State would lose this game with a receiver at quarterback, 26-13. Ending the 2002 season at 8-5, they would win the ACC, which is why they got to go to the Sugar Bowl, and would finish 7-1 in conference. But this was an era where the ACC deserved its reputation for being a joke conference. Florida State essentially only beat ACC teams. The Noles won 9 games, 7 of which were against ACC teams. The 2002 season was notable for several reasons. One being, it was clear that this recovery wasn't going to be instant. A lot of us Seminole fans were hoping that it would just be a one-year thing. Also, Jeff Bowden would start to receive his first fire as Florida State's offensive coordinator for what was a very vanilla and straightforward offense. Very predictable when you're watching the games. We would often just run 3 straight times. There was a lot of criticism coming down. Also, there was this really unfair criticism at this time, in my opinion, of Bobby Bowden, the belief being that Bobby didn't have his own house in order, that he wasn't making decisions anymore, and he was instead delegating the decision-making to his son. Either way, Seminole fans were frustrated after years of incredible success to see the Seminoles falling back down to a, let's be honest, average program. Because winning 8, 9, and 10 games doesn't make you a bad program, it's just average. The 2003 season started with a little bit less fanfare from the press, but I personally remember a little bit more enthusiasm from fans. A lot of us thought this would be the year where Chris Ricks would turn the corner and become that quarterback he was supposed to when he was recruited. Florida State fans would actually get exactly what they were hoping for in the opener, as Florida State would get revenge on North Carolina, crushing the Tar Heels at North Carolina 37-0, before crushing Maryland 35-10. Florida State would then play a close game with hated rival Georgia Tech, 14-13, crush Colorado 47-7, and absolutely annihilate Duke. Then it was Miami time again. This was really where Jeff Bowden started to get so much hate. I remember this game. It was a rainy day. Miami had a lot of players who would eventually be drafted, guys like Jonathan Velma, and all Jeff Bowden would do is run the fucking football. A lot of Seminole fans were very frustrated by this. He had no faith or trust in Chris Ricks to throw the ball, and Florida State was very anemic on offense. They would lose 22-14, and these scores kept getting lower. Following that, Florida State would beat Virginia, but notably again failing to break 20 in that effort. Florida State would rack up easy wins over Notre Dame and Wake Forest, but this was not a good Notre Dame team. This was a pretty garbage Notre Dame team. However, Florida State would pull for it all the way up to number 3 in the nation when they played an unranked Clemson team. This was the year, if I remember properly, where Jeff Bowden would find the most hate from Seminole fans. Reason being, if you look at the two prior games against Virginia and Miami, you have less than 20 points. But this was really the game where Jeff Bowden would find himself under incredible fire. Florida State would lose to unranked Clemson while being third in the country, 26-10. The Noles could only muster 10 points. Florida State would come back and beat NC State 55-44 in 2 overtimes, and then beat the Gators 38-34. But when in a rematch against the Hurricanes in the Orange Bowl, Florida State would lose again, and again only managing 14 points, as the Noles would lose 16-14. The reason I bring up all these low scores is because a narrative was starting to be built. Now, I know what you might be thinking. There's a lot of these games that are 37-0, or 47-7, or 56-7. Why were Seminole fans so frustrated around this era? Now, if you were around the team in this era, and you're not just reading online internet stuff, you remember personally, a lot of people hated Jeff Bowden. They wanted him gone. They thought he was a problem. The reason being, Seminole fans in this era didn't care how many points you scored against Wake Forest or NC State or Virginia or Maryland or North Carolina. We were supposed to beat those teams by 50 points, we all thought. We cared about how many points you scored against Miami or Notre Dame or Florida or Miami again. And if you look at these games, a lot of them, Florida State failed to break 20 points. This was unacceptable even in that era. Florida State was a high-scoring team under Bobby Bowden, and 20 points wasn't going to cut it. So the 2003 season added to extreme frustration for Seminole fans, because a lot of us Seminole fans thought we had a chance to play for a national championship that year when we headed in to play Clemson at Clemson. Clemson was unranked. There was really no reason to assume the Tigers would beat the third-ranked Seminoles, and if Florida State had beaten Clemson, then the Noles likely would have went to the national championship game that season, because Florida State was already 3 and they beat Florida to end the season. Of course, they probably would have lost the national championship game, but I'm just putting that out. So the 2004 season would start with some optimism. Florida State finished with only really 1 game away from playing for a national championship the season before. Florida State would start the 2004 season rated number 4 and would get a primetime game on ABC at 8 o'clock against rival Miami, who was rated number 5. Now, Miami was starting to decline at this point. The Hurricanes were already starting to have some big issues, but they still had a shit ton of talent. Florida State would end up getting beat in overtime by Miami 16-10. This would just increase the pressure on Jeff Bowden so much, as Seminole fans were furious that Florida State could only manage 10 points. Chris Ricks had several interceptions in this game. I believe he threw 2 to Miami great Sean Taylor. Florida State would roll off 6 consecutive wins following this game, however, the most notable of which being about a month later, on October 16th, when Florida State would play 6th-ranked Virginia. I remember this game because a lot of people were picking Virginia to win a national championship that season. Florida State would pants Virginia, 36-3. This would pole vault Florida State back up to 5, as the Noles would barely survive a game over Wake Forest. Unfortunately for Florida State, and because the universe hates Florida State would lose to Maryland the following week, 20-17. This would really end any chance Florida State had to play for a national championship that season. The Seminoles would go on to beat Duke and NC State before losing, I believe, Chris Ricks' only loss to Florida, 20-13. At this point, Florida State would win their bowl game against West Virginia. However, at this point, the pressure on Bobby Bowden to fire his own son was getting extreme. Florida State managed 20 or less points in 6 games this season, including one where they scored 29, which I didn't count. The Noles failed to break that 20-point margin in 5 of those 6 games. It was obvious that offense was the big problem for Florida State, and a lot of Seminole fans had caught on to it. A lot of Seminole fans believed that Jeff Bowden had to go. Until Jeff Bowden went, Florida State couldn't return to being what they once were. There weren't too many fans at this point blaming Bobby Bowden, but that was coming very soon. The 2005 season would begin immense mounting pressure on both Bobby Bowden, the university, and the coaching staff to find a way to turn around this pathetic period of Florida State football. Unfortunately, you're only as good as your last win, and fans weren't shy on their criticisms of Bobby Bowden at this time. Florida State would open the 2005 season with a victory over Miami. This seems like it could have potentially changed a lot of the fortunes Florida State had. The problem being, Miami was also in great decline at this point, and Florida State only managed 10 points. Florida State would crush the Citadel the following week before beating a ranked Boston College, knocking off Syracuse and Wake Forest. But that offensive issue would show its ugly head again on October 15th as the 4th-ranked Seminoles would go play Virginia. Florida State would lose this one 26-21. What was unfortunately becoming clear is Jeff Bowden had a very, very, very basic offense. He was going to run the ball 9 times out of 10. Teams that could stop Florida State from running were able to hold the Seminoles offense to a relatively low amount of points. There wasn't very much creativity in an era where offenses were starting to evolve. Florida State would beat Duke and Maryland the following 2 weeks, which wasn't a surprise because the Noles could easily run the ball against both of those 2 teams. The 9th-ranked Seminoles would play NC State, a team with more talent, and would only muster 15 points in a loss. Florida State would lose 15-20, and things would just get worse. Florida State would only muster 14 points the following week, losing to Clemson and only a touchdown against Florida. This continued the intense frustration Seminoles had with Jeff Bowden. The Noles fans were calling for Jeff Bowden's head. They were screaming for Jeff Bowden's head. Bobby was still mostly ignoring this, as Jeff Bowden was his own flesh and blood, and the man didn't want to fire his own son. Florida State would head to the ACC championship game and absolutely shock everyone, as they would beat 5th-ranked Virginia Tech. At this point, Miami and Virginia Tech were in the ACC, 27-22. To give a little bit of hope, Florida State would head to the Orange Bowl to play 3rd-ranked Penn State. This game was a surprisingly well-played classic. Florida State would end up losing in triple overtime, 26-23, to 3rd-ranked Penn State. Unfortunately for Bobby Bowden, this would really raise expectations for the 2006 season, because you just played the 3rd-ranked team in the country and almost beat them. Florida State would start the 2006 season with another victory over a still declining Miami. The reason that stays still declining is Miami hadn't hit rock bottom yet, where they had those fights going on with Central Florida, and they had to fire their coaching staff, and they had gun and arrest problems, but they were quickly heading in that direction. Florida State would again beat Miami 13-10, again showing offensive struggle. But for the first time, those offensive struggles continued the following week over Troy, as Florida State would get a 24-17 victory over Troy. Then the Noles would lose to Clemson, 20-17. As you see, the scores are still pretty pathetic. Florida State would get an easy victory over Rice, 55-7. Of course, this game is vacated because the NCAA is run by morons. If you don't know that story, the NCAA claimed that Bobby Bowden provided test answers to players so they could pass their test and play game. This is around the same time all that Joe Paterno stuff was going on that we won't get into. I felt like it was total bullshit then. I feel like it's total bullshit now. Pretending like every coach doesn't give test answers to players is laughable. But anyway, the NCAA would force Florida State to vacate the Rice game. Florida State would lose the following week to NC State, 24-20, before beating Duke in another vacated win, 51-14. The Seminoles would drop the next 2 games as well to Boston College and Maryland. Again, if you look to the first part of this season, you see Florida State, with a little bit more than half the season over, had only managed to break 25 points 2 times, both against cream puffs. The offensive struggles had continued. The Seminoles would beat Maryland badly, however, the following weekend, 33-0. Before a lot of people's final straw, in my memory, I remember it, I really didn't think it was as bad as everyone else did because this was a really good Wake Forest team, but this was a lot of people I knew's final straw. This was the moment that a lot of Seminole fans lost their mind. Florida State was pantsed in Tallahassee on November 11th by 19th-ranked Wake Forest 30-0. This was really the moment that a lot of Seminole fans decided that something had to change, and they were just screaming for it. Florida State would beat Western Michigan and then lose to Florida, again mustering an only pathetic 14 points. However, this Florida game was actually one of the bright spots of the season, as this was the Urban Meyer Gators, and Florida State would lose 21-14. I honestly thought this game was going to be like 55-7. It was one of the high spots of the year. Florida State would beat UCLA in the Who the Hell Cares Bowl 44-27. The 2006 season was a trash can fire. Florida State failed to break 25 points in eight of their games. It was clear that something had to change, and actually they broke 28 against Western Michigan. Otherwise, it'd be 9 of their games where they failed to really score enough points to be considered an offensive power. The Seminoles had fallen from one of the most dominant offensive teams in the country to an absolute joke. So in the 2006 offseason, Bobby Bowden made the difficult decision among mounting pressure.
So much criticism. It's usually the weak-hearted. And so maybe we...
From the administration at Florida State and the fan base to fire his own son. Now, this was interesting because Bobby wasn't just looking for a new offensive coordinator at this point. He was looking for a replacement.